Hello everyone, and you're very welcome to today's session for the Digital Business Services T-Level. And we will be looking at the employer set project task today, the delivery of the project, and some ideas for supporting your students. The plan for today is to provide an overview of the employer set project before going into each task individually and having a look at the requirements therein and ideas to support your students. Just a quick introduction first. So my name is David Kiernan and I work in the provider development team at NCFE. And I support providers with the delivery of our qualifications, the structure, understanding the assessments, and anything related to teaching and learning. My direct email address is shown, but if I'm unavailable, then do please use our general provider development email address. And I'm also joined today by David Seddon, our digital subject specialist, and I'll let him introduce himself now.
Hi everybody, thanks and welcome to the session. For those of you that don't know me, just a little bit about my background. I've been with NCFE now for just over 12 months. Prior to that, my experience is really from working in a large FE college where I worked for over 20 years. And through that time, I've delivered and managed computer science programs across both further higher education, advanced higher and degree apprenticeships as well. And I've been involved with T-Level since they first started development. The college I was at was one of the first colleges to pilot the qualifications. And it's through that involvement with technical qualifications and things like that that you can start to see why these are essential in supporting the digital sector. You know, these are the qualifications that will help build the next generation of competent and technical professionals. You know, they're meeting that industry needs and filling the skills shortages. And we're seeing that now in our profession. So I think they're an ideal qualification. Thanks, David.
Thanks, David, very much for that. So we're now going to begin with the high-level overview of the T-Level employer set project. So here is the core content, which is broken into the knowledge content, consisting of the 12 root elements for the Digital Business Services T-Level, and the 6 core skills that students will need to demonstrate. And the core assessments are made up of 2 subcomponents, 2 exam papers, which are designed to assess the student's knowledge, and an externally set skills assessment called the Employer Set Project. And it's called this as the tasks have been developed in conjunction with employers to make them as occupationally realistic as possible. The core assessments will be available in the summer and autumn terms, with the Employer Set Project, or ESP, in May and November. When students sit the core assessments for the very first time, they will need to sit both subcomponents in the same assessment series. So all of the core content can be assessed together. Retakes, however, can be the exam papers only or the employer set project only, and it will be their best grade that carries forward. And the core assessments are graded A* to E and U or ungraded. And there is one other part of the technical qualification that I want to highlight, which is the general competency framework. And this lists the English, maths, and digital skills competencies that students will also be taught. Again, the focus for students to have threshold competency for that job role. That was the purpose of these tasks and why we make them as occupationally realistic as possible, so students can demonstrate this. So these competencies are an important factor of that, and they are also assessed by the Employer Set Project. And they are embedded within the specification and within the core skills, but it would be very useful to develop these further with your students where you can. I will just have a summary of the tasks in the Employer Set Project before going into each task in more detail. So this particular Employer Set Project has pre-release materials, which should be issued to the students 3 weeks before the assessment window opens. And this is to give students a chance to familiarize themselves with the sector focus of the brief and any other relevant information, such as researching e-commerce and the economy. This would also then be checked by tutors to ensure it meets certain requirements, such as being on 4 pages, the font size used, etc. All these subsequent tasks are supervised by yourselves, by the provider. And task 1 is about using the information in the brief to make project considerations and potential risks, and the production of organizational charts like flow charts or Gantt charts, etc. Task 2A is about what steps might be taken next. For example, it might be explaining the type of data you would require to meet the needs of the brief, where you could source that data, what you would do with it, what you think those actions would be beneficial, etc. Task 2B is about actually handling the data, cleansing it, analyzing it, transforming the data into a more meaningful output, etc. And there might also be other supporting documents needed, like an entity relationship diagram. Task 3 is about communicating ideas to different audiences, technical and non-technical audiences. And this is achieved with the production of a presentation. And task 4 is a reflective evaluation, in which students consider the project and how well it went and how well they met the needs of the brief. Now, the very first sitting of these core assessments has just happened this summer, 2022. And here are the grade boundaries for the exam, for the employer set project subcomponent and also the exam subcomponent. Now, for easiness, I've converted the raw mark required in the assessment just into a rounded percentage. And we can see here 36% was needed for an E grade in the employer set project from the summer. Now, do remember that grade boundaries can change from one assessment series to another. So these may not be the same grade boundaries for the upcoming autumn or summer series, but it should hopefully serve as a useful guide when it comes to measuring students' performance. So we're now going to look at the pre-release task in a bit more detail. So the pre-release task has no set time limit and can be issued to students 3 weeks before the assessment window opens. And this allows students the opportunity to research the specific industry relevant to the brief. For example, retail, travel, food. So this way they can familiarize themselves with the business environment. And it will also require them to research other contextual factors relevant for the brief and the assessed tasks. Some examples of this can include e-commerce and the economy, the value of digitalization within the stated sector, customer satisfaction, factors that can drive change, any security and legislation for collecting, storing, and analyzing data, etc. Now, a key issue identified in the recent employer set project was students not referring to the aims of the business and how their work will support with meeting those aims. So it is well worth practicing this with students and getting them to the habit of always identifying those aims and considering those aims constantly when they are discussing their work. And always ensuring that their actions are taken relate back to the purpose, aims, and context of the brief. Now, this work isn't assessed, and students can have access to copies of this research during subsequent tasks. This would be for reference only, though. They wouldn't be able to change or edit this research in those subsequent tasks. This can also be completed at home, and there is no set time limit for this task. However, the tutor does need to check this research, so it's best if it's handed in 1 week before the assessment window begins. This way, the tutor can perform the checks during that week, with the purpose of these checks being to ensure that the assessment maintains its validity and helps to prevent any malpractice. And on screen are the tutor checks, which isn't really about the content of the research as such, but more about having certain requirements, such as fonts, including references, the number of pages they're allowed to use, etc. And if the student's research doesn't meet these requirements, then they can have the opportunity to make any necessary changes, which is again confirmed by the tutor before beginning the first task. Now, giving students the opportunity to practice their research skills and making connections to the aims of the briefs is going to be very useful and essential for students. And you could provide some different contexts for the different root core elements, such as an organization changing its marketing strategies or its sales methods, and so on. You can provide students with some example templates and writing frames when practicing these skills. And it's worth bearing in mind the information that they might actually want to include for subsequent tasks. I'm now going to hand over to David Seddon, who's got some further suggestions.
Thanks, David. Yeah, familiarising with sector focus. You know, a lot of the time it might be a fairly neutral area. So get students to be used to looking at different scenarios where they've got to look into that sector and highlight trends. You know, it's easy to focus on a sector that you're familiar with, because as you're doing it, your opinion comes into the equation. But if you give students topics that maybe aren't as popular or not something they'll be as familiar with, it'll make them explore it in more depth. You know, choose topics that appeal maybe to an older generation. So when they're looking at it, they need to research that, because they won't know. You know, if you're looking at holiday destinations, choosing things like cruises or holidays for over 60s, that type of thing. Familiarising with target audiences, that gives them a chance to then start looking at demographics and identify what the audience is like and how the sector focus can then be aligned to that. And we can use exercise in class to get students thinking about audiences and how companies attract them in. You know, for example, if we talk the gaming consoles, you know, what's the typical demographics that you'd have for gaming consoles, and get them to compare something like the PlayStation and the Switch, which are total opposite consoles, to start looking at how they're marketed differently and how they then target the audience is slightly different. Looking at what's the key focus. You know, are they looking at, is the scenario looking at targeting a new market segment, or are they looking at developing new marketing platforms? You know, we get case studies in class. We can get them looking at how companies adapt to technological changes, or how the demand for change comes in. We think back, look at the shift from video through to DVD, through to streaming services, and how businesses have had to adapt to keep up with it. So thinking about, you know, how a business might need to diversify based on those technological changes. How do they currently work? You know, what's the business doing? How do they sell the products? What are the products they sell? You know, get them going through the scenario and picking things out, and again using case studies for that. You could even give them products. You know, think of a product that sells well. You know, a mobile phone or a smartphone might be a good example, and get the students to look at how they see the products that companies selling, how they see the more popular ones going, what marketing campaigns are they doing, how are they pushing those products? Because the more they can do it with a product like that, the easier they'll find adapting to it when they get the scenario. And I think it's Simon Sinek does a really good TED talk where he looks at, he calls it the golden circle. And the golden circle highlights different ways that companies sell more products if they believe in their product, and showing how the product they're selling really makes a difference. So again, it's quite a nice TED Talk video worth watching to get that message across. When looking at the scenario, you know, is there any opportunity for growth? The scenario might identify that they want to grow a particular area or a particular sector. again, using case studies in class to see how companies have survived technological change by adapting the services. As I've already mentioned, we've got the video going through to streaming services. Or look at the music industry, how that's evolved, and how it's currently adapting again based on retro demands. And then, are there any areas of research that the scenario really focuses on? What does the pre-task say that should be the focus? It might be several things. It could be security, it could be legislation, it could be e-commerce, it could be digitalization. But there's so many different things in class. Focus on each one individually, so that if you went through a scenario or took a business as an example, you could focus on what's the business really done using digitalization to evolve. And that way they're looking really in depth at how that business might have taken on new systems, introduced new electronic systems that they're working with. And that way the students are starting to question it, they're starting to dig that bit deeper, and it'll make them more familiar when they're with the scenario. The more used to working through something like that, reading the scenario, picking out key snippets, it's the better for students because they'll quickly adapt to it when they get the pre-study task, and get them to really focus on what is the key points that message is getting across, that so they know what they need to do from a research point of view. Thanks, David.
Excellent. Thank you very much for those suggestions, David. So that is the pre-release task, and now we're on to the very first assessed task, which is task 1, considering the project. Now, this particular task is scheduled by you, the provider, during the first assessment week, and that will actually be from the Monday to the Thursday. And students have got a maximum of 3 hours for this task, and you should schedule a 15-minute rest break for any students, for any task, lasting 3 hours or more. And this rest break will need to be supervised and in a controlled room. Now, for task 1, students will be required to apply their understanding of project planning tools by using that information in the brief. They'll be required to plan an appropriate order to work through each stage of the project. And these project management tools can include flowcharts, Gantt charts, etc., as requested by the brief. And this is also followed up with an email offering justifications for the decisions they have made in relation to the scenario and aims of the brief. And students can have access to the internet, and this is to access any online resources or tools they may need to help them complete this task, such as tools to create the project management chart, so the flow chart or Gantt chart. Now, this is the only purpose of having the internet. It's not to do any further research. So in order to ensure this, a copy of the student's browsing history is also submitted as evidence. And privacy mode should be disabled, as well as the ability for students to actually delete their browsing history. So ensure that that's deleted. Those features are disabled as well. Now, from the summer 2022 exam series, the chief examiner found that students' Gantt charts had a clear layout and structure, and did comment as well on the various tools used by different students. However, an area for development was about more careful consideration of the actual tasks themselves, such as the order of those tasks, whether one task depends on the outcomes of another task. And indeed, if there's any tasks that can actually be undertaken concurrently, so in order to reduce the project delivery time. And for the email, the chief examiner noted there was good consideration taken with the potential risks with the project, but making the connections to the business aims in the brief was an area that was lacking. And students should continue to refer back to those aims and the context. And that is something that we'll be mentioning quite a lot during this webinar. I'll now hand over to David with some more suggestions for preparing your students.
Thanks. Yeah, as was mentioned, the use of project planning tools, the tools will change each year when there's a different paper. So making sure that students are familiar with all the different types of planning tools that are highlighted in the specifications. For example, if they need to create a Gantt chart, have they clearly identified the tasks and stages, what needs to be completed in it, when should it be completed by, what the task order is, so they can get all the information out of the assessment into that planning tool. The information will be clearly available, so have they created accurate plans based on it? And if we use projects in class and working in groups, plan through a range of planning techniques. For example, start with having them creating a flow chart for something, and then taking that to the next stage and starting to bring it through into a Gantt chart. Have them follow the plan so that they can see realistically how that plan would work. Are the timescales accurate that they're putting in? And if it's not and things are going wrong, what would they have to put in place to adapt the plan or change the plan? And what would the impact of something changing have on the rest of the project? Because the clearer they are with how the project runs and where things can go wrong, the easier it is when they're bringing all that information into it. There's loads of example case studies out there on projects that failed due to bad planning. So, get students to find these so they can see where something badly planned or scheduled in a project can end up with the project failing. The more familiar rather with the purpose of that tool, the better they'll be able to apply it. And as we said, converting your information provided into your plan, can they include any additional information that will make the plan clearer? For example, some people might, or some students might use colour coding to link tasks to departments. And if they've done that, have they been consistent with it? And have they included a legend so that whoever's looking at the plan knows what the purpose of the colour is? Or maybe they've coloured things based on a risk. And if they've done that, again, have they explained why they've colour-coded things? There might be things that we do and we put it in there because it makes sense to us, but have they clearly articulated the purpose of why they've done something? And communication's clear, we've got that in the emails and things like that. Are they clear? Do they link back to the scenario? Have they used the correct terminology? Is the communication professional? Have they explained everything that's requested in the assessment? That's things we can practice in anything that we work with. And if we've got students going back out into employment, that clear communication about the working with the employers will feed into this as well. Thanks, David.
So the next task is considering what is needed next for the project. So task 2A. And this task is again provider scheduled, and it also occurs in the first assessment week. So again, from that Monday to Thursday, and lasting 2 hours. And students are going to be required to produce a document for a team meeting in which they demonstrate their understanding of the fundamental characteristics of data. And this could be in relation to data types, data sources, data storage, etc. So students will need to explain what they would need and where they would get it from, explain what they would then do, and then justify their decisions. Now, they will not be required to action their actual approach, as the task is designed in a way to be hypothetical. And this is because the subsequent tasks will provide students with specific data sets in order to ensure that any mistakes as well aren't carried over from previous tasks. Now, some of the findings from the summer Employer Step project was in relation to the selection and sourcing of the data. And the chief examiner found students were able to explain the sources of data needed and being able to give specific examples of data or information needed, and being able to explain why it's needed. But some areas for development were around a more balanced approach to the information, as some students were putting a bigger focus or bigger emphasis on either internal or external data. And another development point, and again, this is a recurring point, a recurring theme throughout this, is about referring back to those business aims and that actual context that's been given in the brief. It is essential that students do make reference always back to those aims and how their choices will help them to meet the aims of those briefs. I'll hand over again to David for some further suggestions.
Yeah, thanks, David. So, what's the purpose of the meeting? If they look, is it scope and is it planning? Is it a new product launch? If they can identify why they're doing the meeting, that'll put some context into what they're looking at and why. What data should they be included? Are they asking students to explain where they might be able to source the data, but also what data they might need and the type of the data that might be required? The scenario will provide that insight, and there'll be guidance there. If they follow it through and they're used to reading it, they'll be able to pick out what's required for that. And I think it's understanding who the document's for. Is it for a team meeting or is it for another stakeholder? Because that'll help to identify the audience that you're aiming at. Is it technical or non-technical? There's a chance to consider your potential internal data, your sales, your marketing, and your external data, things like competitors or market research. And obviously, there's more options available. So ensuring students are familiar with how a business uses data, what data is typically used internally, what data is typically brought in from external data that a business might use for making business decisions, how they could use it, what the data's saying and why. And probably one of the easiest ways is use guest speakers in class. I know it's not easy to bring in guest speakers all the time, but if you're struggling, get somebody in from the college or the sixth forms, MIF department or marketing department, or even bring in both in if possible, and get students to interview them. So the students are trying to dig deeper and find out what data they're using, what data is most relevant to them. Then let your students discuss this before bringing the guest speaker back in. They can then quiz them a bit more about it. We've talked about this, identified this data is really relevant, and then test it with the people to see if they're right with what they're talking about. You could do the same idea using case studies. For example, what data would be most useful for a new technology company starting up developing a new smartphone? Something along that kind of idea. Thanks, David.
Excellent, thank you very much for those. So our next task is about working with the data supplied by ourselves, by NCFE. And this task is on a fixed date and time. And this is actually going to be on the last day of the first assessment week. So on the Friday of that first assessment week. And students will be issued with a selection of valid, reliable data sets and also data sets that require cleansing. And there's going to be 3 actions that students will need to perform. So number 1 is to cleanse one of the data sets and apply a data modeling tool, such as an entity relationship diagram. Then analyze the data sets. And this again should be against the key aims of the business in relation to that scenario of the brief. And they'll have to create a new data set by integrating what they feel are the more significant parts of the data provided. And then create an email to their line manager, for example, which outlines the technical steps taken and will provide justifications for why they have processed the data in the way they have. And again, referring back to that and how that works against the needs of the business detailed in the brief and those aims. Now again, students can have internet access for this task, but it's only for accessing those online resources or tools they may need to help them create different elements, such as the entity relationship diagram. So again, a copy of their browsing history would be required as the evidence for that. And again, some of the key findings from the summer 2022, beginning with the first action of data cleansing and the modeling tools. Positives included the production of the entity relationship diagram for the information given in the brief, and actually the cleansing of the data as well for certain aspects, being able to identify some of the key aspects. However, though, some students didn't fully cleanse the data, and they often missed out relevant columns or information there. And on occasion, this information was missed just from students not fully scrolling down through the data provided. For the second action, the data analysis and the data set creation, positives included using tools appropriately, such as the creation of dashboards using the data sets provided. But again, referring back to the aims of the brief was another developmental area, and being more selective then about the information used by making that connection to the aims of the business. And for the very final action of the email, students were able to explain how the data was cleansed and how the entity relationship diagram was created. But students needed to also explain why they presented the data in the way they did and how it is relevant to the context and the business aims. So again, referring to those business aims, referring back to that context is very important. Now, one thing that you might want to consider using with your students could be a skills booklet to monitor the development of the specification content while students are on placement. Then naturally you'll get a better idea of the areas students might be strongest in and weakest in amongst your cohort. Now on screen is an example of what this booklet could look like, and I've just used the skills given in the digital technician, the data technician occupational specialism content. But this can also be done with the core content as well. Let's say with core skills 4, and you could get students to record when they've identified and recorded potential risks, threats, or vulnerabilities, or even in terms of some of the knowledge content and getting students to identify when they've used evaluation tools, such as marketing analytical tools, like social media analytics, financial analytical tools, any reporting tools or data mining. And by using an approach like this, it will give students a bit more responsibility for their learning and development, as well as giving students an opportunity to reflect. And it actually could link in a little bit to the final task, the evaluation, and getting students even to think about like CPD needs from this reflective piece they're able to do. And as well as this, as well as providing students for an opportunity for reflection on their placement, it will give you as a teacher, as a lecturer, an idea of which skills and knowledge students might be stronger in or weaker in, depending on how often they've had a chance to practice them. And then you can use this information to have some skills-focused lessons for the students. I'm going to hand over again to David Seddon, who's going to add some extra suggestions on here.
Thanks. Yeah, making sure that students know what they're being requested to do. You know, they might need to cleanse data, for example, and this might be things like different formats or missing data or numbers stored in text fields or even numbers entered as text, so that they can identify different things that they might need to cleanse. And can the students follow a process to cleanse the data? What problems they've encountered and how they've resolved it. So it's not just can they do it, but can they explain what they've done and why they've done it? You know, they've been asked to create a data model. Again, it'll change every year, but it could be something like we said in the past, you know, creating an EOD based on data in a data set. If it is, do they know about primary and foreign keys? Do they know about relationship between tables? Information you'd store in a table? Are they familiar with data models and ones that are in the specifications? Because again, it could be any of those. And as mentioned, you know, is there any key aims that they're trying to get out? If there are, then these will be the things that really help the students when they're looking at the data and thinking about the data model. You know, it might help the students to remember what they've previously looked at for other businesses. For example, they could be asked to consider trends and patterns that support the business aims. Therefore, students need to be able to analyse data sets and then create a new data set incorporating key data that meets that business needs and then draw the conclusions. So same as David's mentioned a few times, you know, it's going back to them business aims all the time. And obviously, the more experienced students have of working with different data sets, the better. And there's loads out there. The government provide hundreds of free data sets that can be used for students for analysis. Alternatively, there's other sources. A lot of them might be US based, but it doesn't matter because you're looking at working with data and you're giving students ways of cleansing the data. So it doesn't matter whether it's UK or US based that you're working with. Again, it could be that tutors download data sets and then take smaller data sets from this for students to work with. And again, there's a couple of links on that slide of where you can easily access some free data sets that you can work with. Or get students to research something that they're interested in. You know, they might be interested in games, they might be interested in Marvel Cinematic Universe. You know, get them to research something that really interests them. Can they find out existing data for that? Get them to collect whatever data they can find on that, and then get them to create up a new data set using the information they've found, and then perform analysis on it, maybe some kind of visualization or dashboard based on it. But if you're using data that students like, it's a bit more interesting and they can see reason why they're doing it and why they're collecting that data. And finally, communication's key. You know, they'll need to explain things like what they've done, why have they done things, actions implemented, processes followed. Can they explain it technically or non-technically? And this is their chance to really explain what they've done. You know, justification's key. Sometimes there might not be a definitive answer, as it could be quite subjective. You know, there might be numerous ways the data set could be approached to meet that business needs. So it all depends on what trends and patterns they might be able to identify, and can they justify how they've identified those trends and patterns and why they think those are the ones that are most important. And again, it then gives them a chance to link back to that business aims and objectives again. One other thing, I know David's mentioned it a couple of times now about the browser history. Make sure students are familiar with this, that they can see what the browser history shows, so that they know that anything they use in the internet's monitored, all the websites they're visiting is logged down so they can see where it's going. And that way, it might prevent them using it in ways they're not supposed to. You know, for example, a student might look for something, they might be allowed to use it to create an ERD, but not to tell them what should be on the ERD. And if the word in the search is wrong, it might look like they're looking for things that they're not meant to look for. So just make sure they're familiar with that browser history. Thanks, David.
Excellent. Thank you again, David, for those. And good points as well about that browser history. So now we are on to task 3, the presentation task. So this task is 3 hours long, so a 15-minute rest break should be scheduled, and it is provider scheduled as well, and this takes place within the second assessment week. And for this task, students are to create a presentation for a particular audience, again, such as a technical or non-technical audience. So students will need to consider the language and terminology they use accordingly. The students will be issued with all of the data sets that they use in task 2B, as well as copies of their new data sets they would have created. And they're to create digital slides for the purpose of explaining and evaluating the role of data analytics, and again, relating this to the business context and aims detailed in the brief. Include visualizations of the data, explain the impact on internal and external stakeholders, and any potential risks and mitigations as well from the decisions being made. And again, for this one, students can have internet access, but just again for the purpose of those online tools and resources, such as tools for the creating data visualizations. Now, the recent findings again from the summer found that students were able to create a presentation quite well for the non-technical audience, which is required here, and were able to explain the role of data analytics and able to identify potential risks. However, though, students needed to ensure that they are given explanations of how data analytics can be used and for the risks, including possible mitigations for the risks that is identified. So again, with this main theme being relating it back to the aims and context of the brief. So how the data analytics can be used for their aims and the mitigations, those risks, how have they come about, and how can they be mitigated as well. Now there's also digital skills assessed here, and really they try and help students get the higher level for the digital skills. They should make use some more of the speaker notes, say on the presentation software they use. As the chief examiner noted that many students opted to have all the information directly on the slides. So that was a bit, that's quite a lot of information then to contain on those slides. So being able to utilize the other tools there. And it would also be good to use a range of different ways to visualize that data. As it was also found, some students just used what they had done in task 2B and didn't really do any other sort of data visualizations. So it's good if that range can be included. Now, that considering the audience aspect, as David has already mentioned as well, that is an important aspect for the T-level. And so, and it is as well part of that general competency framework too, in those English skills. So what you could have, so what you could do to help students develop these areas is by having them produce different materials, such as a leaflet, a presentation, or some form of information package. But they have to produce ones for those different audiences, such as customers versus stakeholders, or even if it was in terms of IT, like an IT user and an IT technician, you know, different stakeholders, and being able to tailor those languages appropriately and the terminology they use. And again, I want to hand over to David Tin for some additional suggestions.
Thanks. Yeah, I've students creating presentations in class. You know, they should be familiar with creating and presenting. Can they use visualization? You know, are they working with bars, charts, data tables, etc.? And do they know which is the best bar or chart or table to present the data that they're looking at presenting? So have they got the best graphic for the information? Is the text clear on the screen? Is it easy to read? Spelling and grammar correct? And is the consistency with it? You know, there's plenty of opportunities in class to get students to create presentations following any of the analysis that they've done. And it's good practice for when they go into industry, because you'll always have to present any information that you've found out. So wherever there's opportunity, build in those presentations. I know we've mentioned it a few times, identify the audience, but they should be able to clearly identify from a scenario who the target audience is. You know, if you get students to present something to either employers or teachers or to the peers, that way they're explaining something technical, and then get them to present the same information to a group of students that aren't technical. You know, for example, you might have students in your college or your sixth form that are doing catering, and the data students could then present information to them about how a restaurant might use data to improve bookings and social media influence. So the information they're getting across would have to be non-technical while they're explaining what they can do. And if you get them used to working with different audiences that way, you know, present something to the teacher and then present it to the parents so that they can see how it changes. The focus of the presentation, can they identify from the scenario what the focus is? You know, it's sometimes easy to miss the point. Make sure that students are used to looking at a scenario and taking that as the basis for the presentation format, and that way they'll know they're covering everything in it. And I know, again, we've mentioned it a few times, the stakeholders. When considering this, think of it from everybody else's point of view. What information does the stakeholder need from this presentation? You know, they could be presenting something to two groups of students, and they'd have to change it. If you was working in industry, you might present something to a team, and then you might present it to senior managers, and with the same information, but you'll adapt it based on that audience. So can the students do that? For example, you know, employing more staff to work in stores might help getting orders out faster, but it could then impact on other departments, training staff and recruiting staff on motivation. So it's really getting what's the point of what they're trying to get across, and then could they get that out to different audiences? And finally, the risks. You know, when looking at this with students, think about the risk where they're handling data. And it could be, you know, the more data they're handling, the more chance of opening a data breach, which then would lead on to legislation and prosecution. You know, are students familiar with those business risks when they're working with data? And, you know, it's not all about the fine, it's all about its reputation as well. You know, have students considered the data handled by your college or your sixth form? You know, get them to look at what type of data the colleges hold and how that might be different. You know, you might hold things like lecturers or students or parents or employers, for example. What types of data would you hold for them, and how would that data differ per person or per stakeholder? And then, you know, how could the college go about keeping that data safe? And if they didn't keep it safe, what would be the impact of a breach? And who could that breach impact on? And you might even be able to get your own data protection officer to come in and do a guest talk. So it's just really using whatever resources you've got available, and use internal staff wherever it's possible to try and give guest lectures. Thanks, David.
Excellent, thank you, David. And good point about internal staff. Often we forget about the value and experience and knowledge that they can bring as well. So we're on to our final task now. Task 4, the reflective evaluation. Now this task is 2 hours long and is scheduled in the remainder of that second assessment week. And for this, students will complete a reflective evaluation in an appropriate occupational style. So this could be presented as a CPD development request form or an appraisal, etc. And this will evaluate the decisions the students have taken throughout the project, and they should be applying a relevant reflective model. And they will also be required to demonstrate their understanding of the need for future learning and development in a professional context. And this should be written in a manner, again, appropriate for the audience. So this may be a technical audience, non-technical audience. More than likely, in a scenario like this, it would be a technical audience. And again, some positives from the Summer 2022 series included good explanations of the skills and processes used during the project, as well as including the tools and techniques used and how they were used within the project. However, referring back to those project aims was again another area identified for development. So, explaining the skills and process used and how did that help to achieve those project aims. And students did also find it challenging to be able to do that sort of self-evaluation of their own CPD needs. And students still need to understand how important it is to identify those developmental areas. After all, they are in their first year of studies or their first year of their career in digital business services. So knowing those developmental areas can be very useful for students' success. And I will hand over again to David Seddon one final time for some suggestions for task 4.
Thanks, David. Yeah, I mean, with this one, reflection's key. Look at the reflective techniques that are in the specifications. For example, can they use Kolb's learning cycle or Gibbs reflective cycle? Get the students to use these techniques when they're doing the placements. Do they keep a reflective log? If they do, they could use that technique then for each of the day's placement that they're working. Maybe even speak to the employer and ask if the students can use maybe the last 30 minutes of the day just to write up the log. And that way it's fresh in the mind and it's easy to reflect on what have they learned and how have they used it that day. The client's requirements, can they reflect back on what the employer wanted so that they can then reflect on how they've addressed it in the assessments? And again, it's understanding those requirements and that justification in the reflection. Their own performance, what have they achieved? Did they do well? Did things go as expected? What was most challenging? How have they overcome that? And as I said, if they're doing logs like that, if they're doing logs for the placement, it's easy to use the logs then to evaluate and reflect on their own performance, because you can reflect on how they've performed while they're doing their placement, and they can see then the distance travelled, how far they're getting with it. And as part of that, they could also look at what processes they've used. So what process have they implemented? Did it work well? Did it work as expected? Have they used any tools? If they did, what tools did they use and why did they use them? It's that always what if. It's that digging that bit deeper, and the reflection will bring that out of it. And the key outcome, did they meet what the brief was actually asking? How well did they do it? Were they happy with the performance throughout? And it's a chance there for you to kind of look at, what really did go well? What could have gone better? And if I had to do it again, what would I have changed? What would I do differently? And I think David mentioned it, they should be considering their own CPD at that stage and how they're going to keep their skills and knowledge updated. Again, as I mentioned, with the placement, you could get them to look at this and consider, following the T level, what other technical qualifications would be good for them to undertake. And they could discuss that with the employer and talk about that. So once I've done this, maybe it would be better if I got certification in something like this. I've mentioned it a couple of times, keeping that workplace journal gives them something where they could do an end reflection based on their whole experience. You can use the same technique if you're doing projects in class, and after your project you can get them reflect on how the project went and how they've worked with other students and picking out something that the tools they used and what went well and what could have gone better. but it fits ideal with the placement. It's nice and easy and something to log along with it. And then it's something that the students can use as a study guide later, because it's reminding them everything they've learned. Thanks, David.
Excellent. Thank you, David, very much for all the suggestions you've given. So we're now going to just finish off with the resources and support that's available for you. So I'm going to talk through the resources that's available and in development from ourselves, from NCFE, and what some other organizations are currently doing as well. So our content team have developed and made available example schemes of work, and have also developed and are continuing to develop teaching resources to help with the delivery of the occupational specialism. There's already content delivered to assist with the delivery of the core content. And there are essential resources, which will be free, and we also have additional resources available for a cost. So you will find that these resources can contain an e-learning resource or an e-learning presentation. There'll be activity sheets and or home study sheets available as interactive PDFs, so they can be completed digitally, and session plans to accompany the sessions as well. And I've included on there our learning resources information sheet. And this will let you know which sections of the specification our essential and additional resources actually address. So it can allow you to better choose which resources you may want. Now, aside from our resources, Hodder have produced a textbook for the core content of the digital T-level. And STEM Learning, an organization promoting education and offering support for science, technology, engineering, and maths disciplines, have also pulled together free resources to support with the delivery of the digital T-levels. We have our upcoming events and webinars on the T-level provider support page, and all of our previous webinars are recorded, and we do have a YouTube playlist where you'll be able to view these. And this slide contains information regarding our key contacts. And the first is often the customer support team as your first line of inquiry with student registrations, general queries, etc. As for myself and the provider development team, we support with in relation to teaching and learning and CPD sessions, as well as having one-to-one curriculum consultation calls where we can book in time to discuss your individual needs. And we also have our account managers who support providers with the business of delivering T-levels. And providers have found having that singular point of contact very valuable, as they hold regular meetings with providers, regular updates. So I would like to thank you for attending this session, and I do hope you have found it useful. And my thanks again to David Seddon for his support and suggestions in today's session as well. And from everyone here at NCFB, we would like to wish you a very enjoyable and a very successful year.